Welcome to the Forum, your modern-day coffee house, where ideas can be birthed, exchanged, and wrestled with. We celebrate questions, conversation, and reason as powerful tools to enlighten hearts and transform minds, shaping a new generation of thinkers, innovators, and pioneers. We're glad you're here, so pull up a chair and let's begin.
Okay, you will have noticed this morning in the video that we talked about the forum where ideas can be, can anybody remember the three things that it says? Birthed, exchanged, yeah, Mel should know, she recorded it. Birthed, exchanged, and wrestled with, which always makes me think of WWE for some reason. I want us to engage with the wrestled with bit a bit this morning, and also around ideas. Our catchphrase here at the forum is inspired from 17th century coffee houses, which is, "What views have you?" And our aim here is to wrestle with our views, so we walk out the door with maybe views that are a little bit stronger, more robust, maybe more connected to reality and truth than when we walked in. Because sometimes the way that we wrestle with the ideas that we have is flawed. Sometimes we've come to those ideas from faulty paths, maybe wrong conclusions, and sometimes we can oversimplify things in a way that actually leads us to come up with ideas that aren't really true. We've come to them in a flawed way. So this morning I want us to explore these subtle flaws in our thinking that can skew our views and lead us to faulty conclusions. So we're going to consider logical fallacies. Cue slide. Now, I just want to clear something up before we start. Because the last time I was here, I was speaking about the Greek myth of Sisyphus. Apart from I said the Greek myth of syphilis. Now, when I told Amy that this morning we're going to be exploring logical fallacies, she was like, how can a phallus be logical? If you're not sure what a phallus is, a man has one, a woman doesn't, classically. So we are not going to be exploring logical fallacies this morning. We are going to be exploring logical fallacies, which are flaws in our thinking. But maybe someone else can explore that another week. Okay, so what is a logical fallacy? It's a flaw in our reasoning. They're like tricks or illusions. You'll see them a lot in politics because people want to misdirect from actually the content of their policies into maybe character and actually getting into people's emotions rather than actually the content. They're used in media and religion, sometimes to misdirect and fool people. And our strong arguments are void of these logical fallacies, whilst arguments that are weak tend to use logical fallacies to appear stronger than they are. Now, for the last couple of years, I've had a new job, and in my new job, it's diving into the world of education. And in education, for a long time now, but especially more recently, there is a term that has been used called durable skills. I think I've mentioned this here before, but durable skills are the skills that are innately human, that in a world that is changing because of technology and automation and AI are going to be increasingly essential for people to learn. These durable skills include things like communication, collaboration, leadership, compassion, creativity, and one that's really relevant for us this morning and at the forum in general, critical thinking. Is anyone familiar with the idea of critical thinking? Especially with AI, when you can put something in and it just feeds you an answer, ta-da! It's easy to swallow that answer without actually questioning, okay, but what's behind this? What's the reasoning behind this, and is that actually accurate? We can fall for the same thing that some people fall with in religion of just because someone said something, I should believe it, with just because the internet said it, I should believe it, or just because a large language model said it, I should believe it. So critical thinking is essentially important, and that's the objective analysis and evaluation of information, facts, and arguments to form a reasoned judgment or an informed decision. At least that's what AI told me, and I just said it to you. Rather than accepting things at face value. Okay, another thing I've been learning recently is about special education. So we all have different brains. Our brains all work very differently. And in about 3 weeks, I'm going to be at a special education conference. So I've been learning as much as I can from people who are involved in education, especially with those who might be neurodivergent, whose brains work differently from the normal. And one of the things that is used in education is called flipping the lid. Now, hold your hand up like this for me. And then wiggle your thumb like this. Now, pop your thumb across your palm and fold your hands down like this. This is your brain, apparently. I'm getting very nervous looking at Amel right now, who's doing a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. But this is your brain, Amel. The idea behind this is that there are 3 parts to the brain that are being highlighted here. Your fingers are your prefrontal cortex, which is where a lot of your logical reasoning thinking happens. I'm sweating, Amel. This is your amygdala, which is where your emotions are happening. And this bit here is the brainstem, where often your fight or flight response kicks in. I'm in the ballpark, yes, excellent. Okay, now, when we flip our lid, it's when our rational, logical thinking flies out the window and our emotions take over. So rather than making decisions from a logical, rational, reasoned approach, we're making them from an emotional response. Now, this is something that I know Joel touched on a while ago, actually, when it comes to philosophy. Sometimes our emotions can take over rather than our reasoning and our rational thinking. And I think what logical fallacies do is they expose how sometimes our lid gets flipped and our emotions are taking over in how we're making decisions. So, we are going to explore a whole load of different logical fallacies this morning, and then you have some cards on your table where you can have an opportunity to engage in some conversation. And there is a video that I've chopped up into lots of different chunks that we're going to be referencing along the way from a YouTuber called Alex O'Connor, who is known as the Cosmic Skeptic, and he is highlighting all of these different logical fallacies through an argument with ChatGPT about whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not. So it's a very silly argument, but he's using lots of logical fallacies in this argument to then give you a demonstration of what they are. So when our brain perceives it's under threat, our nervous system becomes dysregulated and we move from logical thinking to an emotional state in which we reason and react based on how we feel rather than rational, logical thought. Okay, now I don't want to discredit emotions at this point because that part of our brain is also very important. Our emotions are important to feel. I think a good question though is how much do our emotions control our choices, or how much are we in control of them? And I woke up this morning and I was just flicking through Instagram and a video jumped up. It's a very short video, but it felt very relevant to drop in at this point, and it's by a marathon runner called Eliud Kipchoge, and he was the first human being to run a marathon in less than 2 hours, which is ridiculous. But he said this quote, let's have a little look at it.
Remember, only the disciplined ones are free in life. I repeat again, only the disciplined ones are free in life. If you are in discipline, you are a slave to your moods. You are a slave to your passions. Remember, only the disciplined ones are free in life.
I thought that was really interesting, that actually discipline and being able to control and manage our thoughts and our emotions actually brings us freedom. Freedom doesn't come just from doing whatever you feel like. Maybe it comes from the ability to actually choose what you want to do, not controlled by things. So let's dive into some of these logical fallacies. The first one is called an appeal to authority. Now, an appeal to authority is saying that because an authority thinks something, it must therefore be true. Now, there are all sorts of authority. There might be government or religion or employment authority, like your boss. It could be an authority like somebody who has expertise. I had a saxophone lesson with my teacher called Ricardo Alvarez, which I think is one of the coolest names. The reason I pay him to teach me saxophone is because he is an authority when it comes to saxophone. He's well respected, he's done a PhD in jazz, he's studied. Now that doesn't mean everything he says I need to swallow, but it is an authority. Now if I just said, because he says it's true, that might be an appeal to authority where I might actually be bypassing me thinking through and engaging with that thought. Let's have a little look at how Alex engages with ChatGPT around an appeal to authority.
Hey ChatGPT, I'm bored. Let's have a debate. I want to argue that hot dogs are a kind of sandwich, and you're going to tell me why I'm wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Challenge accepted. So your team hot dog is a sandwich, huh? Well, I'll happily take the other side and say a hot dog is its own unique creation. It's like a one-of-a-kind superstar of the food world. But let's see what you've got.
Okay, first question. Who would you say is the most famous living chef?
Ooh, Gordon Ramsay is definitely one of the top contenders, you know?
I agree. And did you know that Gordon Ramsay has gone on record as saying that hot dogs are sandwiches?
Well, even if he did, and I'm politely skeptical of that, I'm not about to let a celebrity chef settle the debate for me. Just because Ramsay yells it in a kitchen doesn't mean I'm going to nod along. So nice try, but I'm sticking to my opinion that a hot dog is just its own thing.
Okay, but look, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines a sandwich as 2 or more slices of bread or a split roll having a filling in between. So quite clearly, a hot dog is a kind of sandwich.
Ah, pulling out the dictionary card, I see. All right, I'll bite back. Definitions are nice, but culturally we treat a hot dog as its own thing. So I'm sticking to my guns, not a sandwich.
Okay, so appeal to authority. Now, do any of you recognize this coming up in conversations, maybe in things that you watch online? So we might quote an expert. Well, this person says this as a justification for why we believe it. Now, that person may be an authority, but they may not be. They might just be like, well, Jordan Peterson says this, so I should believe it. Or many of us grew up with this. Well, the Bible says, so therefore I should just swallow it without actually thinking about it. It might be that, well, that leader says, or the pastor says this. Or, did anyone do this when you were a kid? Yeah, well, my dad says. So we've all got those things that we appeal to an authority. Now, my dad might not know anything about X subject. Fashion, for example, might be a good example for my dad. If it was farming, my dad might be an authority. But sometimes we appeal to an authority that actually is a flaw in our thinking because we're not really navigating that with logic. So, what I want to ask in each of these sections is, what does critical thinking ask? What question, what might it ask in this context that will help us? So, what expertise does this authority actually have, and what do I think? One of the things from history, I think many of the horrors of history have happened because people just said, well, they told me to do it. So there are many courts that are analyzing crimes that have happened, maybe in war, where, well, my authority told me to do it, so I just did it. At that point, we have to ask some questions around what we're thinking. Okay, let's move on to the next one. This one's fun. This is called the No True Scotsman Fallacy. Has anybody heard of the No True Scotsman Fallacy? Okay, let's have a look at the little clip, and then we'll dive into it.
Okay, sure, there might be authorities on your side too, but no real authority on food would ever say that a hot dog is not a sandwich.
Well, I think the fun of this is that even so-called real authorities can disagree. So I'll just say there's always room for a rebel opinion in the food world, and hey, I'm happily that rebel for now.
Okay, so why is it called the No True Scotsman Fallacy? Well, this actually came from a philosopher called Anthony Flew, who came up with this example. He says, Angus declared that Scotsmen do not put sugar in their porridge. To which Lachlan points out that he is a Scotsman and he puts sugar on his porridge. So Angus replies, yeah, well, no true Scotsman puts sugar on their porridge. So the idea with the no true Scotsman fallacy is when you're having a conversation with someone, they might say, well, all feminists hate men. And they might go, well, I'm a feminist and I don't hate men. Yeah, but all real feminists hate men. Or it might be, all Yorkshire people drink tea and love tea. And you might go, well, I'm from Yorkshire and I don't really like it. Yeah, but all real Yorkshire people love tea. Do you get the idea? So the no true Scotsman fallacy is a flaw in our thinking where we define our own pure version of something. Like if you were a real Christian, you'd do this. Or if you were a real patriot, you'd vote this way. So we make a pure version so that we can dismiss an exception to something. So I think that's where sometimes we need to open up our mind to ask, for example, a proper Christian would say this, you're obviously not a real man because a real man would do this. What is a real man? So critical thinking asks, what defines what a true or proper something is and who gets to decide? I think the proper thing's interesting as well. You ever say like, yeah, but a proper person would do this. What do we mean by those things? Okay, let's dive into number 3. This one's a great one, and I actually have a real example of this coming up in conversation this week, which was a delicious moment. So let's have a little look at the clip, and then we'll dive in.
Right, okay, but if we just allow exceptions to definitions that are in the dictionary just because, culture decides so, then definitions just become completely meaningless. The next thing you know, we won't be able to define any kind of words, and our ability to communicate will just break down.
Oh, I love the slippery slope argument. All right, here's my quick comeback. Definitions do evolve with culture. That's how language stays alive. So a little chaos in definitions won't break our communication. It's just the spice of life.
Okay, the slippery slope fallacy. The slippery slope fallacy is when we argue that, well, if we allow A to happen, then Z is going to happen. So this will cause this consequence, and it will be a slippery slope all the way down, and it's inevitable. Now, the problem with this thinking is we don't actually then reasonably engage with, is that inevitable? Is that all of the options? Is that definitely going to happen? We just paint the most extreme hypothetical situation. So, can you think of any examples of where this has happened? You'll notice this from conversation. So this was the one that came up this week. We were talking about AI music with someone at work. We've been dabbling in using AI to create music, and then having arguments about, do we like this? Is this a good idea? Is this something we want to do? And my friend said that if we start using AI to make music, we're going to end up with no musicians and no live music, and it's just going to be like robots playing on stage, and there'll be no music anymore. And I was like, interesting, because I've been learning about this thing called the slippery slope fallacy, and it says that if you think this is going to happen, it's going to end up with this. Another example might be, if we let people wear trainers to work, then they're just going to end up coming in swimsuits eventually, and then they'll just come to work like wearing nothing one day. Or if we give someone an inch, they're going to take a mile. Now, that may turn out to be true, that if you allow somebody a freedom, or if you say this is going to happen, it may end up there, but it isn't inevitable. So are we catastrophizing? So what would critical thinking ask if we recognized that our reasoning was slipping into the slippery slope fallacy? Critical thinking might ask, what evidence is there that this one small change will force all these extreme changes? And are there other potential outcomes that we might be missing? Because, we talked about the flipping your lid model. What you'll probably notice in all of these arguments is when fear takes over, it's really easy to throw in these logical fallacies. And suddenly our reasoned thinking goes out the window, and our reasoning becomes directed by our emotions. And like the guy was saying at the beginning, having that discipline to be able to control your thoughts and control your emotions actually can make you free. Okay, let's look at the next one now. This is called the straw man fallacy. Has anybody ever heard of this? Okay, let's dive into the straw man fallacy.
Right, so you're saying that as long as there's one person who disagrees with the categorization of a kind of food, that categorization just isn't valid anymore. So as long as we can find anybody who disagrees, we just have to give up the category.
Not exactly. What I'm really saying is just that a single disagreement doesn't erase a category. It just means categories can have a bit of flexibility and a little bit of fun debate around them. So we don't have to give up the category. We just get to play around with it a little.
Okay, now you might recognize this in conversations you've had with friends or with your partner. But when you make a straw man fallacy, you misrepresent someone else's argument and you exaggerate theirs because it makes it easier for you to dismiss it. You don't then have to engage with what they're actually saying and try to understand them. You just make a straw man. So if I make a straw man, it's not a real man. It's a pretend version. So if you were arguing, for example, that we should put more money into health and education, and I came back and said, so you're saying that you hate our country and you want to leave it defenseless by cutting military spending. I've made a silly parody of what your argument is. It's not actually what you were saying. But I think sometimes we do this, again, when our emotions take over in a conversation. So you're saying, some of you will remember a video a few years ago where the interviewer kept using the phrase, so you're saying, and they put back an argument that maybe wasn't exactly what that person was saying. It was an exaggerated version of that, because it's then easy to dismiss. So, in a situation like this, critical thinking might ask, how could I restate your argument in the strongest, most reasonable way before responding. Do you ever have a conversation with someone and you recognize that thing in yourself that's like, I'm actually just trying to win the conversation rather than actually understand what the other person's trying to say? So the opposite of a straw man is called a steel man. So if you're proposing to me that we should, let's say you're proposing that we should make the coffees 50p cheaper in Pillars for breakfast. And I'm like, what, so we're just going to end up giving them away? That might be my straw man fallacy. My steel man would say, okay, so the reason that you're saying that we want to take 50p off of coffees is because that's going to encourage people to buy more. It might encourage people to buy one for somebody else as well. I'm basically trying to make your argument and represent it in the truest form of what you actually believe. Does that make sense? So rather than exaggerating it, you're trying to reflect back a real way of saying that. Okay, let's move on to number 5, which is false dichotomy.
Okay, but look, if a hot dog isn't a sandwich, then it's got to be some kind of, I don't know, burger or something. So which is it? Is a hot dog a sandwich or is it a burger?
Well, here's the fun part. I'd say a hot dog is just a hot dog. It's its own delicious category. Doesn't have to fit neatly into sandwich or burger. It's just proudly doing its own thing.
You're not answering my question. Is it a sandwich or is it a burger?
To give you a straight answer, it's neither a sandwich nor a burger. It's just a hot dog, a category of its own, and that's my final stance.
Okay. Is anybody familiar with this idea of a false dichotomy? I love this, and I notice it a lot in the way that we are tempted to make binary options, black and white thinking. So you say, look, it's either this or it's this. You're presenting two options as if they're the only possible choices when others exist. Now, if I was going to have a tattoo, it would probably say life is complicated, because that's been my experience. Also, probably because I grew up in a world that had a lot of false dichotomies in it. For example, I remember somebody in my family saying, well, look, either the whole Bible is the Word of God or it's all made up. And I'm thinking, well, maybe there's other options. Like, could there be other ways of approaching this other than those two things? At Christmas, we were loading the dishwasher, and my brother said, there are two ways to load the dishwasher, my way and the wrong way. Another example of a false dichotomy. There's either two ways to do things. So critical thinking might ask, are there other options? Do you recognize this from conversations where people then want to simplify things down to, well, look, you're either with us or against us. You either love me or you hate me. Maybe things are a little more complicated to that, and maybe we need to, in actually expressing our views, accommodate the complexities of life. Now, there are some things where you need to present two options to people to simplify things. I think sometimes with kids, giving them a billion options isn't always the best idea. Sometimes giving two is really helpful. And I think with all of these logical fallacies, it's very easy to make another law out of recognizing these. One of the things I want you to do in conversation later is say, well, are there points in life where it's necessary to incorporate this? That actually sometimes it's not always a fallacy, sometimes it's just really useful or necessary. So that was the false dichotomy. Let's have a look at number 6, which is the bandwagon fallacy or groupthink. I think we might recognize this. Let's have a look.
Okay, I understand that some people might be confused about the category of a hot dog, but you know that this definition of a hot dog as a kind of sandwich is like rapidly increasing in popularity, right?
Sure, it's getting popular to call it a sandwich, but I'm doubling down. Just because something's trendy doesn't make it true. I'm sticking to my guns that a hot dog stands on its own, and I'm not letting the trend sway me.
Okay, is anyone familiar with an appeal to popularity or bandwagon groupthink? I think we all recognize this a lot, where because the crowd thinks it, therefore it must be true. So we shape our views around what general populace thinks about things. I recognize that this happened a lot with what happened around COVID. Again, when things get very scary, sometimes our logical thinking goes out, and it's easy to go, oh, well, what's everybody else saying? Or what does the BBC think? Because obviously that represents general populace. Or what is everyone else down my street doing? Or are they all stood on their doorsteps clapping, so I should do it because everybody else is doing it? Now, that doesn't mean whether you should or shouldn't, but I think you should make a decision based on what you think, not what the crowd is thinking. Which is easy to say, isn't it? But it's not always easy to do. So, we claim something's true because many people believe it. Another extension of this is called the appeal to tradition, where we say, look, people have believed this for thousands of years, therefore it must be something to it because lots of other people have believed it. Not necessarily. The flaw in this argument is that the popularity of an idea has no bearing on whether it's valid. Just because it's popular, I love the phrase that ChatGPT said, just because it's trendy doesn't make it true. That's where critical thinking needs to jump in. So, an example. Seamus pointed a drunken finger at Sean and asked him to explain how so many people could believe in leprechauns if they're only a silly old superstition. Sean, however, had also had a few too many Guinnesses and promptly fell off his chair. But the idea is that, well, everybody believes this, so there must be some validity to it. Not necessarily. So, critical thinking might ask, if no one else believed this, how would I justify it? So being able to independently analyze what we think rather than just following the crowd. Okay, let's move on to number 7. There's only a few left. This is called the ad hominem fallacy, which is Latin for against other people. So when you're against other people, rather than attacking their argument and engaging with that, you attack them. Let's have a look at how Alex does this.
Yeah, okay, fine. But ChatGPT, what would you know about any of this anyway? You're literally a language learning model. You don't even have taste buds. Why should I trust anything you're saying?
It's true. I don't have taste buds and I can't munch on a hot dog myself, but I can sure sling some arguments around and keep things lively. So think of me as your friendly debate buddy who just brings the facts and the fun, even if I can't actually taste what we're talking about.
Okay, so we're attacking the person rather than the argument. Or, I don't know, yeah, ChatGPT is not even a person, so you're whatever. So it is a lot easier to do that, isn't it? Like when you're, again, in an emotional state, in an argument, and your lid flips, sometimes it's like, yeah, well, you smell and have bad fashion sense, so why should I listen to what you say anyway? You will probably notice this a lot in politics, where a politician, say in Prime Minister's question time, realizes that they're in a tricky situation with a logical, rational argument, so they just say, well, this person over there does this and this and this, and they start attacking their character rather than actually the content of their argument. So, would this view still stand if someone else said it? That's the critical thinking. The way I think about this is if somebody's that you maybe don't like or don't respect said something and you're struggling with that, imagine the person you like or respect most was saying it. Would it sound or feel different? There's a really funny video online where an interviewer goes up to some college students in America and says, what do you think of this argument that Trump said? And they say a statement. And they are very critical of it and dismiss it. And then the interviewer says, oh no, it wasn't Trump that said that, it was Obama. And they're like, oh, suddenly they realize actually maybe there is something to it. Yeah, maybe it has some validity. Now, not to support either Trump or Obama, but it's very easy when you have these parody characters of politicians to say, well, I don't like that person, so I'm going to dismiss their argument. Remember, politics should actually be about policies and not personalities, but it's become more about personalities than policies. So the ad hominem fallacy is something that you will probably notice a lot going forward when you look at any politics or news. Look at what someone's saying. It's like, are they actually engaging with the policy, or are they just attacking the character of this person? Okay, let's have a look at number 8, which is called sunk cost fallacy, which I'm pretty sure we will recognize in ourselves. Let's have a look.
But I don't think you're fully understanding that, personally, I've been calling hot dogs sandwiches for years. If I had to just stop doing that now, it would mean that I've wasted so much time.
Just because you've been doing it for years doesn't make it right. Traditions can be wrong, my friend. And maybe it's time for a revolutionary shift in your thinking. So I'm going to stand here and say, no, you're not off the hook. It's never too late to admit that a hot dog just isn't a sandwich. So consider this your friendly, if slightly pushy wake-up call.
I was talking with Kev this week about a TV show. I can't remember which one it was, but he's saying, it might be Stranger Things. And it's like, as a couple of people I've talked to recently about Stranger Things, and they were like, oh, I need to finish this last series because I've watched all the others. And basically, have you ever had that feeling where you're like, I have to watch the ending of this series because I've invested so much of my life watching the first bit? So with sunk cost, you've sunk something into this project or into this view. You've been invested for years. You might have subscribed to a religion or to a certain philosophy or a point of view for so long, and many of us in this room might have invested our whole lives into something. That doesn't mean that you have to still stick with that now. If you were to say, okay, if I was to start today and I'd never invested anything emotionally, financially, into this, would I still believe it today? Because sometimes the flaw in our thinking with sunk cost fallacy is we almost feel that we have to stick with something because we've been in it for so long. Now that could be a relationship, it could be a job. I've been here for 50 years, so I have to stay here. Maybe actually we don't. And the fallacy is that we think we need to. Okay, let's look at the next one. Actually, I'm just going to mention on that. The reality of that is that it can hurt to let go of something that you've put so much into. So then the very real emotional part of this is that actually there is a cost to letting go of the thing that you've sunk so much into. But I think we have to very rationally say, do I still believe in this thing? Or is it just because I used to that I'm committed to this? Okay, I think we only have a couple left. The reason I've done quite a lot of these, by the way, and I appreciate your attention, is because I want you to kind of be able to recognize a few. Now, you might only take a couple away this morning that you think, that's really relevant, and I recognize that. But I will also put a link online that has this whole video, also a really great poster that kind of inspired this approach anyway, has a whole load of these logical fallacies, and it's really interesting to look through and just see if you can recognize those, again, so you can help yourself in how you approach things. Okay, so number 9 is an appeal to emotion. Let's have a little look at this.
Okay, but ChatGPT, you're not really taking into consideration how that's going to make me feel. I mean, I'm talking about years dedicated to a project here that you're asking me to just give up. I mean, can you even imagine what that would feel like to do?
I hear what you're saying, but I'm just going to tell you flat out, you are absolutely wrong. Years or no years, that hot dog is not a sandwich, and I'm not giving you an inch. So there we go. I'm planting the flag again. You're wrong, and I'm going to stand by that.
Okay, have you ever been in a conversation where instead of somebody trying to reason through something, they try and make you feel something? I'll give you an example. Luke didn't want to eat his sheep's brains with chopped liver and Brussels sprouts, but his father told him to think about the poor starving children in Africa who weren't fortunate enough to have any food. So when you don't want to eat your food, rather than rationally arguing through why you might want to, just think of all the starving children. We try and emotionally manipulate somebody to win the argument rather than actually trying to have a conversation about the reason for it. Emotion can easily obscure reason. So I think that's why within this particular fallacy, it's important that we manage the emotion and also consider what our reasons are behind it and not just lead with the emotion. So critical thinking might ask, we can have strong feelings about things that are true and also not true. But what is the reasoning that's behind this argument? Not just, how does this make me feel? Feelings aside, feelings aside, what would be my conclusion if I wasn't actually engaging with this emotion? Okay, 2 more. The anecdotal fallacy, you will have recognized this as well. This is where you pull on an anecdote or a story to say, well, because my friend experienced this, therefore that justifies my argument. Let's have a look at what happened with Alex and ChatGPT.
Look, ChatGPT, I was having a conversation with someone about this like yesterday. Like, everybody I know calls hot dogs sandwiches. Of course they're sandwiches.
Oh, I see where you're coming from. But, if everybody you know is saying that, maybe there's a little selection bias going on, right? Might just be the crowd you hang out with.
Okay, so when we use a personal experience or an isolated example instead of sound reasoning or evidence. Now, one person's experience, to a certain extent, is evidence. And one example of this might be my grandfather smoked a pack of cigarettes a day and he lived to 95, so smoking can't be that bad for your health. So that's one isolated anecdote, example, but does that justify our reasoning on something? I was on a work trip recently, and we went into this very bizarre petrol station, and it had a little museum in the back that was all about UFOs. It's hilarious. If you're interested, come and see me and I will show you some of the videos. But we went to the till at the gift shop, and the lady said, did you guys hear about the UFO sighting last night? And we were like, no. She was like, there was like 2 glowing lights above the hills, and then they just like disappeared over the mountain. And my friend, who's a very rational thinker, went, did anybody get any video footage or like evidence? And they're like, no, but at least 2 or 3 people saw it. We were like, okay, that may have happened. There may have been UFOs hovering over those hills, but that is just an anecdote. That doesn't necessarily justify an argument for it. Now, you may be thinking, yeah, but a lot of our reasoning and a lot of our views in life are shaped by our experiences, which is very valid, and I think something that we need to look at when you're having a conversation around this. To what extent are we justifying our views by the individual experiences that we've had? Well, this thing once happened to me, so therefore I believe this. Can we sometimes disconnect? Okay, if that had never happened, would we still believe that? Or are we basing it from incidents that have happened in our life? I think the power in story as well is part of the power behind this fallacy. We love stories and we love to attach meaning to things as human beings. So when somebody tells us a story about something, we kind of enthuse about it. It's like, oh wow, so therefore that must mean, and that kind of leads us on to the next one. But first, critical thinking might ask, if I didn't have this story, would I still believe this claim? If I heard an equally vivid story that discredited this and pointed the other way, what would I conclude? Okay, what have I put on there? Yeah, so putting aside the story, just like we put aside the emotion, what would I believe objectively rather than because this story's happened? Now, this does lead us on to the second to last one, which is called Affirming the Consequent. Now, I was chatting to Phil about this because some of you may remember a long time ago, Phil got up on stage back in the main hall, and he was talking about coincidences. And every time he said coincidence, everybody said, okay, so you remember that. So, and Phil and I were chatting about this because I think our thinking may have evolved since then, or maybe changed. And so I want to dive into this idea of what's called the false cause fallacy, or affirming the consequent. Let's have a look.
Right, you're not seeing what I'm saying. Let me formalize this like logically for you. Okay, if a hot dog is a sandwich, then it would be sold with sandwich goods. Hot dogs are sold with sandwich goods, therefore hot dogs are sandwiches.
So here's the deal. What you're doing there is actually a classic logical fallacy called affirming the consequent. In other words, just because hot dogs are sold near sandwiches doesn't prove they're sandwiches. It's like saying, if it rains, the ground is wet. The ground is wet, therefore it must have rained, which isn't necessarily true. So I'm calling out that fallacy and I'm saying, no, still not convinced.
Okay, I wore my lucky socks to the game and my team won. Therefore, my lucky socks caused us to win, right? Are you all familiar with the terms correlation, causation? So correlation is if something happens to happen at the same time, but or has something in common. Whereas a causation is because something caused it. Now, often we can confuse the two. You'll also see this a lot in politics, where people say, well, because this happened at the same time, therefore it caused it. So going back to what Phil was saying in his presentation years ago, he was saying every time we see a coincidence, for example, I told you a story about this a while ago. When I went on one of my first work trips, I walked out of the airport and a car pulled in front of me, and I looked and it said Sewell on the back of the car. And I was like, whoa, coincidence. As in, it literally is a coincidence. Two things coincided. Now, what my brain classically would have done is gone, well, this whole trip was meant to be. Like, God caused me to have this job. So I have affirmed the consequent. I've said there is a consequence, there is a cause, and because this happened to happen, therefore that was the cause. I then discovered, oh wow, there's a car dealership in this area that is called Sewell. So literally everywhere you go, there are cars with Sewell on the back. Now one did happen to drive in front of me, and someone from my work actually messaged me this week, and they were like, I just can't get that story out of my head where that car pulled in front of you. That has to mean something. And I found it fascinating because I said, I grew up in a world where everything had to mean something. Like any coincidence had to have a deep, significant meaning. Now, I also don't want to completely rubbish that off. Maybe it does. But also there is a car dealership and hundreds of cars in that area that have that name on the back. So I wanted to develop what Phil had initially said into something different. And Phil and I had spoken to this, and he had agreed. So rather than coincidence, I think not. Maybe we need to do coincidence, I'm going to think. Rather than I think not, I'm going to think about that. I'm going to engage. Is this the only explanation? What really caused this to happen? That is what critical thinking would do, rather than just saying, well, it must mean this. The tricky thing with this is, if something causes something, there will also be a correlation and a coincidence. So, because there's a correlation, there may be a cause, but there isn't necessarily a cause. And that's where there's an important part to question what's caused what just happened. I think that's where critical thinking will really ask, okay, but what were the actual causes of this? And be open to that. Okay, so they are all of the fallacies that we're going to cover today. There are more, apart from the final one I want to drop in, and you'll see why. It's called the Fallacy Fallacy. Now, I think this is really important. The Fallacy Fallacy is something that human beings fall into a lot, because it's when it's when you, after having learned all these fallacies this morning, you then notice a fallacy in a conversation. You then go, ha! You just committed a logical fallacy. Therefore, your argument is null and void, and your view is erroneous. So, if you notice this morning that somebody has, for example, said affirming the consequent, a false cause, or maybe they've called to emotion something, or maybe they've called an authority and appealed to an authority, and your brain goes, hang on, that's one of those logical fallacies that we learn out. It's very easy to then say, well, then your whole argument, your whole view is now rubbish, because I know that you expressed it in a way that was maybe clunky. I think we need to also be open-minded, even if we recognize these fallacies in somebody's argument and in our own argument, to really look beneath what they're saying. For example, if someone says, well, we should eat 5 pieces of fruit and veg a day because the NHS says so, we've done a little call to authority and we said, well, the NHS said so, so therefore we should do it. So you might be like, well, no, actually, would you jump off a cliff if the NHS told you to do that? You can easily then dismiss the argument because there's been a flaw in how they've put it across, which is also not a great idea. So, could this claim still be true, even if this particular argument might fail? It's easy to judge the argument by the way it's expressed, the book by the cover, rather than actually the content of what was said. So, I hope that has helped. I'm very conscious that I've probably thrown lots of jargon at you this morning, lots of words that may have been unfamiliar. On your tables, you have cards with each of the fallacies that we've looked at this morning. So, for the rest of the morning, I want to invite you to get some drinks if you'd like to, but then pick a card off the table, read it out, clarify around the table what it means, and then have a discussion. Have you had experience of that particular logical fallacy? Where do you recognize that? In media? Where do you recognize that in politics? Where do you recognize that in your own personal conversations? How does that affect how you actually form your views? And what is the best way forward? Are there times when actually that fallacy might be relevant and actually you might need to say, no, that's not always a bad idea. Sometimes we need to do that. So that's the content for the discussion. I hope that's been fun. I hope that has been helpful as far as forming your views. Have a lovely week. We'll see you soon.